My name is Elena Harper, and I'm about to tell you how I destroyed my family, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Some people will call me cruel. Others will call me a hero. I suppose the truth lives somewhere in between, in that murky space where betrayal and justice become indistinguishable. Let me take you back to the night that changed everything. The Westmoreland Gala. Black tie. Crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across a room full of society's elite. I stood at the top of the grand staircase in a white Valentino gown, my mother's choice, not mine. She always dressed me like a porcelain doll in her collection. Pretty. Presentable. Silent. I was 28 years old, and I was about to marry Marcus Ashford, a man I'd known since childhood. Our engagement was exactly what it appeared to be, strategic. His family's tech empire. My family's real estate conglomerate. Love wasn't mentioned. Compatibility wasn't discussed. My father had simply announced it over dinner one evening, and that was that. I wasn't unhappy, exactly. I was resigned. As I descended the stairs, champagne flute in hand, I caught sight of Marcus across the room. His dark eyes found mine, and he smiled. My chest performed the obligatory flutter. He was handsome, successful, from the right family. I had convinced myself this was enough. Then I saw my sister emerge from the garden terrace. Natasha. 2 years younger, infinitely more beautiful, perpetually more wanted. She wore midnight blue, a color that made her look like she'd captured a piece of the night sky. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves. Men turned to watch her pass. What I didn't expect was to see her walk directly to Marcus. What I didn't expect was for him to pull her into an embrace that wasn't polite. What I didn't expect was for their lips to meet while my father, my own father, stood nearby, clapping his hands in delight. The champagne glass slipped from my fingers. I heard it shatter against marble from very far away, as though I were watching someone else's life implode. The room tilted. My vision tunneled. And there, in that impossibly long moment, I watched my sister smile against Marcus's mouth. She pulled back just enough to make eye contact with me across the room. She winked. My mother appeared at my side, her hand gripping my arm. "Oh, Elena, darling," she said in that saccharine voice she reserved for public humiliation. "Natasha and Marcus have decided to be honest about their feelings. Isn't it better that this came out now? Before the wedding? We should all be grateful for her bravery." Bravery. That was the word she chose. Around us, guests whispered. Some laughed. The orchestra, oblivious, continued playing Vivaldi. The world didn't end. It simply rearranged itself into something unrecognizable, and I had to keep breathing through it. I excused myself to the powder room. I locked the door, gripped the marble sink, and looked at my reflection. Same dark eyes. Same pale skin. Same invisible girl I'd always been. Only now, I was invisible and humiliated. That's when something shifted inside me. It wasn't rage. Not yet. It was something far more dangerous, clarity. Growing up as Natasha's sister was like growing up in her shadow, literally and figuratively. In every photograph, I was somehow partially obscured, even when standing directly beside her. In every conversation at dinner, my accomplishments were politely acknowledged before the focus returned to Natasha's latest triumph. I graduated summa cum laude from Columbia. My father asked if I'd met any eligible men there. Natasha got a small part in a commercial. My mother framed it. I learned to make myself smaller. Quieter. More accommodating. I learned to smile when it hurt. I learned to disappear. My parents, James and Victoria Harper, were experts in control disguised as propriety. They built their real estate empire on charm and manipulation, the same tools they used on their daughters. My father was the kind of man who could convince you that your own thoughts were his ideas. My mother was the kind of woman who could make cruelty sound like concern. "You're so sensitive, Elena," she'd whisper when I cried. "That's your weakness. You could be so much more if you'd just try," my father would say, as though my best efforts were somehow insufficient. Natasha learned to weaponize their attention. She would deliberately exclude me from events, then act surprised when I found out through other people. She'd steal my ideas and present them as her own, with our parents applauding her creativity. When I confronted her, she'd cry, and they'd comfort her while shooting me looks of disappointment. I became very good at absorbing pain silently. But that night at the gala, watching Marcus and Natasha together while my parents celebrated, something broke inside me. Not my spirit, though. Something else. A barrier. The part of me that had accepted their narrative about who I was supposed to be. I was going to destroy them. Not violently. Not messily. I'm not that kind of person, despite what you might think by the end of this story. I was going to methodically, systematically, and precisely dismantle the empire of lies they'd built, and in doing so, I was going to free myself. Revenge is like architecture. You can't build something lasting by throwing bricks at windows. You have to understand the foundation, identify the structural weaknesses, and apply pressure at exactly the right points. I spent the next 3 months studying my family like an archaeologist studies ruins. I rented a small apartment in Brooklyn under my grandmother's maiden name. My parents thought I'd had a nervous breakdown and moved to a wellness retreat. In reality, I was 3 miles away, living a double life and planning. The first thing I did was hire a private investigator, not to do anything illegal, but to help me understand what I was already seeing. Turns out, my father had been systematically embezzling from the family charity for years. Not for luxury or addiction. For power. He'd been funneling money into shell companies, building his own financial empire separate from the family business. Money laundering isn't legal, no matter how clean you keep the rest of your life. The second thing I discovered was that Natasha had been forging my signature on company documents. She'd been accessing my trust fund and using it to cover losses from failed real estate investments she'd made without consulting anyone. Our grandfather's money that was supposed to be protected, was disappearing. The third thing I uncovered was that Marcus had never actually loved either of us. He was working with a business rival to gain access to my father's client list. The romance with Natasha was a setup. He was using her to get closer to my father, using the engagement to me as a cover for his corporate espionage. All of this was discoverable without breaking any laws. Emails. Financial statements. Public records. Hire a professional, and they'll find what's there. What shocked me most wasn't the betrayal. It was the pettiness of their crimes. These weren't people driven by desperation. They were driven by greed. By the desire to accumulate more than they already had. By the need to feel superior. I also discovered that my mother had been documenting her own malicious behavior toward me for years, in a journal she kept in her private office. I found it by accident during a visit home where I pretended to be still fragile. I read how she deliberately withheld affection from me as a child because she thought I was too sensitive. How she'd encouraged Natasha to exclude me because she wanted me to toughen up. How, in her own words, Elena's weakness makes her easy to control. 30 years of pain, meticulously documented by the woman who caused it. I photographed every page. Patience is a weapon. By month 4, I'd returned to the family home, playing the role of the recovering daughter. I was meek. Apologetic. Grateful for their concern during my breakdown. I joined family dinners and smiled while my mother spoke about Natasha's engagement to Marcus. Yes, they were still planning to marry, and my parents had welcomed him into the fold like a son. I watched them. I listened. I collected. I also built my network. I reached out to an old mentor from Colombia, Professor Diana Chen, a woman my parents had always resented because she encouraged my independence. I told her everything. She didn't judge me. She helped me understand that what I was planning wasn't revenge. It was accountability. She introduced me to two people, James, a forensic accountant, and Sarah, a journalist who specialized in corporate fraud. Neither of them worked for money in this case. They worked because they believed in what I was trying to do. Together, we built an airtight case. We documented every embezzlement, every forged signature, every shell company, every false charity donation. We created a timeline of fraud that stretched back 15 years. We gathered evidence of Marcus's corporate espionage and his deliberately deceptive engagement to both me and my sister, which, technically, made him a fraud as well. But here's what I also did: I didn't go public immediately. Instead, I went to my father. I requested a private meeting with my father in his office. The Harper Building, 40 stories of glass and steel, a monument to his own importance. He seemed pleased. My father always enjoyed private audiences. He liked the power of it. "Elena," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "You look well. Your mother was worried about you." I didn't sit. "I know about the shell companies, Father. All 17 of them. I know about the diverted charity funds. I know about everything." His face went very still. "Excuse me? I also know that Natasha has been embezzling from my trust fund. And I know that Marcus Ashford has been conducting corporate espionage with the Morrison Group." My father's hand slowly moved toward his desk phone. I held up a folder. "Everything is documented. Certified. Legal. It's already in the hands of 3 trustworthy people who will release it if anything happens to me, if I'm pressured, or if you attempt to cover this up further." He stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before: fear. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "I want you to confess to the SEC, full cooperation. I want you to resign from every board. I want Natasha to return every dollar she stole from me. And I want Marcus Ashford arrested for corporate espionage." "Elena, you don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly. You've spent my entire life making me believe I was weak, fragile, and worth less than her. You documented your own cruelty and kept it as a trophy. Well, I'm not weak. And I'm not afraid of you anymore." I placed the folder on his desk. Inside were photographs of his journals, evidence of his crimes, and a letter to the SEC that was ready to be sent. "You have 48 hours to confess. To cooperate. To make this right, or I send this and let the justice system handle it." I turned to leave. "Elena, wait." His voice had changed. It was smaller. "If I do this, if I confess, what happens to the family? The company?" I paused at the door. "I don't know. That's not my problem anymore." My father didn't confess willingly. Instead, he called a family meeting and tried to convince everyone that I was having a psychotic episode brought on by my nervous condition. That I'd fabricated evidence. That I was trying to destroy the family out of jealousy and spite. My mother backed him up. So did Natasha. So I released the documents. It started with a single email to a business reporter at the Times. Within 24 hours, it was front-page news: Harper real estate empire implicated in 15-year fraud scheme. The SEC moved immediately. Federal agents arrived at my father's office on a Thursday morning. My mother fainted. Natasha attempted to flee the country. She was stopped at JFK with 2 suitcases and my grandmother's emerald collection in her carry-on. Marcus was arrested by FBI agents at his apartment. Corporate espionage is a serious federal crime. I watched it all unfold from my small apartment in Brooklyn, where I'd returned after releasing the documents. The next week, my father was indicted on 17 counts of money laundering and fraud. My mother faced charges as an accessory. Natasha was charged with embezzlement and grand larceny. Marcus faced 10 years in federal prison. The Harper family empire, which had taken my grandfather 50 years to build, collapsed in 72 hours. Here's what no one tells you about revenge: it doesn't feel the way you think it will. My sister called me from holding, crying so hard she could barely speak. "Please," she begged. "Please make it stop. Please tell them you made a mistake." "I didn't make a mistake," I said quietly. "You've destroyed us, Elena. You've destroyed me." "No," I said. "You did that yourselves. I just made sure everyone could see it." When my mother was released on bail, she attempted suicide. She didn't succeed, but she spent 6 weeks in a psychiatric hospital, which was ironic considering how she'd always used mental health as a weapon against me. My father's legal bills bankrupted him. The Harper building was seized by creditors. The real estate empire was dismantled and sold in pieces. I inherited nothing because I didn't want to. I returned my trust fund to the family charity and set up a scholarship in my grandfather's name at Columbia. And the strangest thing happened: I felt empty. I'd spent 6 months building this cathedral of revenge, and now that it was finished, I stood inside it and felt nothing. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just a deep, hollow silence. Here's what I've learned: there's a difference between justice and revenge, and I'm still not entirely sure which side of that line I was actually on. My father committed crimes. That's a fact. Natasha stole from me. Also a fact. Marcus lied to both of us. Also true. They deserved consequences. I believe that absolutely. But did they deserve the particular kind of destruction I orchestrated? That's the question that keeps me awake at night. I didn't break any laws. I didn't plant evidence. I simply revealed what was already there, what would have been discovered eventually. I accelerated their fall, but I didn't manufacture it. Still, when I think about my mother in that psychiatric hospital, or my sister's destroyed reputation, or my father's humiliation, I don't feel good about it. I feel necessary. Which is different. My parents are still technically my parents. I still share their DNA. But I don't visit them. I don't call. That chapter of my life is closed, and I've locked the door. Natasha is out now, after serving her time. She works as an office manager in Portland. We haven't spoken. Marcus is still in prison. 7 years into a 10-year sentence. I think about him sometimes and wonder if his fall was justice or cruelty. The line is blurrier than I thought it would be. 6 months after the exposure, I started a consulting firm focused on corporate ethics and transparency. I work with companies to identify structural problems, not just corruption, but systemic issues that enable it. I'm not doing penance. But I'm also not celebrating. I'm not a hero. But I'm not a villain either. I'm someone who was pushed to the absolute edge of her endurance and found that she had more power than she'd ever realized. And I used that power. Whether that makes me righteous or reckless, I'll let you decide. What I know for certain is this: I am no longer invisible. I am no longer small. I am no longer the girl who absorbed cruelty and called it love. I'm the girl who watched her family destroy her, and instead of breaking, I held up a mirror and made them look at what they were. Was it cruel? Maybe. Was it necessary? Absolutely. I spent my entire childhood learning to disappear. Now I spend every day making sure I'm impossible to ignore. Not through loudness or aggression, but through precision. Through strength. Through the kind of quiet power that doesn't need to announce itself. Sometimes, when I'm walking through New York, I'll catch my reflection in a storefront window. I'll see a woman who looks like she belongs here. Confident. Capable. Unmarked by the trauma that tried to erase her. That woman is me now. And sometimes I wonder if my mother was right about one thing: I was always too sensitive. Too feeling. Too aware of pain. But she was wrong about this: that sensitivity isn't weakness. It's the capacity to understand what it means to be truly hurt. And from that understanding comes the power to create accountability. My name is Elena Harper, and this is the story of how I stopped being invisible. Whether you call that courage or revenge, I'll leave to you. But I call it survival. I learned something in the rubble of my family: respect is non-negotiable. My worth was never measured by a seating chart at a gala, never defined by who my parents believed first, never dependent on Marcus's betrayal or Natasha's smirks. I realized that my silence had been weaponized against me, but I learned to weaponize it myself. My patience became power. And in that power, I found my freedom. If my story has resonated with you, if you've ever been gaslit into invisibility, made small by people who should have protected you, I want you to know this: your silence doesn't make you weak. Your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your refusal to disappear makes you extraordinary. You don't have to destroy your family to save yourself, but you do have to believe that you're worth saving. Subscribe and hit that notification bell for more stories about those who rose from the ashes of their own humiliation and transformed it into triumph. Because the revolution begins when you stop accepting their narrative and start writing your own ending. Your worth was never in question. It was only ever waiting for you to remember it.